Erev Tov Chavrim, I'm ben-denoon. You're watching Israeli News Live, a very important broadcast this evening. Friends, this is a prophetic segment of our news. We actually were going to run this particular presentation on Ben-denoon Institute alone, with just a portion here on Israeli News Live. But as I begin to really think about the significance of a prophetic message here in light of news that we're seeing happening there in the Middle East, I really felt like that it was important that we air this broadcast in its entirety here on Israeli News Live as well. So those of you that do appreciate and enjoy these types of messages, please stay tuned with us. Those of you that just prefer the news only, I understand if you prefer not to tune in. I think, though, that it would be a blessing to you nonetheless because we're going to go very deep into the things that are happening in the Middle East and how they actually are very much mirrored by the events that happened 2,000 years ago, leading up to, the coming of Christ, in fact. And I think that's very significant when we begin to look at this. And of course, what got me started on this was the suggestion by Anwar News there that the United States is actually going to build a base. Aman News, that suggested that the U.S. will actually build a base in the very near future inside of Israel. Before we get started in this, no doubt going to be a lengthy broadcast here, let me just remind you guys as well, we are trying to work out all the bugs with our website, IsraeliNewsLive.org and .co.il, as well as Israel Returns, because there were those that were having trouble to help support this work that we're doing. And of course, we do need your help in making this possible, the work that we do here at Israeli News Live, as well as Ben-denoon Institute. So if God lays it on your heart and you'd like to contribute, please visit our website at IsraeliNewsLive.org or IsraelReturns.com. And there's a place to donate there, or our address at the end of the broadcast here. If you are having any difficulties, please email me at stephenbenoon@aol.com. I am way behind on emails, but I try to answer them as quickly as I possibly can. Let's get right into this. So it's very serious here. According to this report here, and I shared this on Israeli News Live just recently, that the U.S. intends to use the Israeli coast as a military base against troops in nearby areas, including Russian forces in Syria, according to the Al-Masada News Amman report. The U.S. National Defense Authorization Act of the NDAA stipulating the Israel-based news website said that according to the NDAA subsection, the U.S. military is to establish a maritime base in the Israeli coastal city of Haifa in the coming years. Now, this is based on the National Defense Authorization Act of 2017 under Section 1259 that entitles the United States to be able to do exactly that. And that's what the report actually comes from. So I think it's a very legitimate report. And in light of this, it only shows me that what Rome did 2,000 years ago, when they had actually conquered Israel and had taken over the country there, and had put their own king in place there, then of course the Roman military was not far behind. And we're going to look at some of that tonight, looking at how this happened all those years ago. As we can see here, actually that's not that one there. Let me go right here. Sorry about that. It is actually and this is what's interesting. In 63 BC, we see that the Romans under the Pompey conquer the Jewish state. King Aristobulus II is deposed. Hyrcanus II reinstated as the high priest, and Antipater, and an Edomian convert to Judaism, is made overseer of Judea. Now, it's kind of interesting. We're going to have to kind of double back real quick a little bit on the historical side of Israel up into this time here, because if you'll notice, Antipater, an Edomian, was a convert to Judaism, and that is what a Jesuit is, but in a reverse order. The Jesuits of Rome, for example, are Catholics, but they are Catholics that were Jews, but they became converts. But it's interesting about the part about the conversion, because what a lot of people don't realize is under the Maccabees, when the Maccabees revolted, and that was around, 167, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere right in that era, 168. The Maccabee brothers actually begin their revolt. Is 166 is when the uprising began under Judas Maccabee, which Maccabee was not actually his real last name, but that's just the name that they're given because of their revolting there. But when Judas Maccabee began to revolt, and it wasn't just a revolt that lasted a few months. This is a revolt that lasted about 25 years. And of course, this is where we get the wonderful holiday in Israel we call Hanukkah. The incredible miracle of lights, as is considered to be under the Jewish beliefs there, where the menorah, when the temple is being restored back, taken away from the Hellenization through the Greeks there, where they had perverted the temple, they found one of the priestly oils there, but it's only supposed to last 1 day, but miraculously seems to last for 8 days. And this is where we get the story of Hanukkah from, all during the time of the Maccabee brothers. Now, the book of Maccabees, there's 2 books, 1st and 2nd book of Maccabees. It is in the Catholic Bible, but it's not in the King James Version Bible there. I believe the Sefer also is another Bible that carries the book of Maccabees as well, both the 1st and 2nd. I can't say for sure, but I think they do as well. But anyway, the book of Maccabees is more of a chronological order of the wars that happened there, where the Maccabee brothers were trying to overthrow the Greeks who had taken and suppressed the Israeli people. But it's also under the time frame of the Greek Hellenization of the Jewish people, when the Greeks had conquered Israel, that we also find that the priesthood had begun to change from the true Zadokite priesthood, the true Levitical priesthood, and eventually, through different political means and things that had happened there, through even murders and conspiracies, that the priesthood is actually changed over from being the true Zadokites, the true Levites, to a non-Levitical priesthood, even including one of the Maccabee brothers, Jonathan Maccabee, who was appointed as a high priest in 152 BC. He becomes a high priest of Israel, totally with, from what I can understand, has no right to that bloodline. I believe he is actually a Benjamite and not a Levite. So the whole priesthood really got all mixed up. It becomes the Hasmonean dynasty at that time there under the Maccabees and forward all the way down to the time of the coming of Jesus of Nazareth, or Yeshua. And so the whole priesthood really gets all mixed up, pretty much, I think, the way it is today. The Pharisees that are in Israel today, believing that they are the true, the priest of 2,000 years ago, but to me they are the Hasmoneans, which are not the true priesthood. We find that around 140 BC is when Qumran actually begins, the Qumran community, or the Essenes that they said that go down there. And this is where it is believed that many of the Zadokite true priesthood, they fled down to Qumran near the Dead Sea because there was such contentions amongst the priests there, the taking over of the priesthood, etc. Now, that's just to kind of set a stage of how the priesthood gets all mixed up there. But what I'm really wanting to share with you guys is what's going on now and what went on then. Now, as I said, the United States is wanting to build a military base, and I clearly see this happening as it did many, many years ago, back when the Romans were taking over Jerusalem, because after the Maccabees revolt, etc., what we have later is that the Jewish people begin to get a little bit afraid of the Greeks coming back or their enemies coming around. And so there is a covenant that ends up getting made with the Romans. They send to the Romans an ambassador. The Jewish people do. The Israelis at that time, they send an ambassador to the Romans. The Romans accept the offer of a joint venture together to keep from... in other words, as the Romans said it, just kind of paraphrasing an agreement that was made back so many years ago, BC there, that if, your enemies are our enemies and our enemies are your enemies. And if anyone tries to harm Rome, the Israelis will come and fight for the Romans. And if anybody hurts the Israelis, the Romans will come and fight for you. That was a covenant that they actually set. No one ever thought that the Romans at that time were going to move into Israel, conquer Israel, subvert the government, and then to totally take over, and then finally in 70 AD, destroy the temple, kill all the Jews that are there and drive them out of the land. Now the problem is we are looking at this repeating in modern days today. And we can actually go all the way back to the Oslo Accords and find this out. Now I think in light of this, and let me just find real quick here, there's a really good article by Joel Boehnerman. Here it is right here, The Vatican Agenda. I want to just share a little bit of Joel Boehnerman's words here, because Joel Boehnerman and Barry Chalmers, they were the two that really exposed the Oslo Accords of 1993, where Rome was once again establishing a relationship with Israel like the Romans did with the Israelis back before the destruction of the Second Temple. And by the way, keep in mind, the Romans also were the ones that were involved in building the Second Temple, but they're also the ones that destroy the Second Temple. So when we look at the United States' involvement with the Vatican and Israel and the things that are going on there, and even Donald Trump saying that, Jerusalem should be the capital, don't think for a moment that that's a good thing, because Herod the Great, who built the Second Temple, was an Edomite to begin with, which is a Roman of today, and a Roman back then as well. He was a descendant of the Romans, and of course, it is his own ancestors, later Titus the Great, who ends up destroying the temple and killing them all off. But don't forget, the Syrians are involved in this as well, and that's where the issue is very serious about what's going on in the Middle East today. So, let's look right here. Joel Boehnerman says, most Israelis have probably never thought very much about what the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican that is, thinks about the end of days theology. Jews themselves don't give much thought to what will happen when Gog and Magog takes place. Jews don't go in for anything the least bit next world, but instead are firmly planted in the here and now, and that's good, he says. However, it doesn't matter what Jews think. What matters is what the Vatican believes and why it believes this. Judaism and modern Jewish thought pretty much just dismiss the basic tenets of Catholicism outright and doesn't even bother addressing the core question of what is behind Catholic theology claims. Instead of taking what they believe seriously, we tend to snicker amongst ourselves when we see these pictures of obscure rituals and ceremonies and think the whole religion is near pagan-like, with the eating of holy wafers and sprinkling of baptismal water. Now, the point that Joel gets into with this is that it does matter what they think, because Rome is intent on making sure that biblical prophecy fulfills in the way that they see it. Not necessarily the way the prophets saw it, but the way they see it. Let's drop down just a little bit in the article here. It says, the essay, right on the bottom paragraph in your screen, the essay will provide the background to that deal, as well as the Vatican's intentions as regarding Israel and the Old City of Jerusalem. It will reveal which Israeli politicians made certain commitment to the Vatican regarding the issue of sovereignty of the Old City, Jerusalem. These negotiations and meetings were all carried out in secret during the time period of 1992 to 1995. The Oslo Accords was what got all the public's attention. Oslo was like throwing sand in the eyes of the public. The Vatican is where the real action was happening. Oslo seemed to be just the cover story, a red herring, if you will. Now, by the way, Barry Chalmers was a very good friend of the late Joel Boehnerman. Of course, they're both passed away now. And Barry Chalmers told me flat out personally about it, about the death of Joel Boehnerman, and as he put it, he was murdered. And that's the way Barry Chalmers looked at it. He said, Steve, he was murdered. And I don't doubt it a bit in the world. Barry Chalmers told me on several occasions they tried to murder him as well. He said anyone that tries to expose what the Vatican is doing inside of Jerusalem becomes a target of those that do not want these plans interrupted. All right? Now, that's just to kind of set a stage for you, the Vatican's intent on taking Jerusalem as well. And of course, they do finally succeed. The Oslo Accord is, as he said, the red herring. It's what we see in the way of the picture of what's really going on. But the secret meetings that were happening at the Vatican is what really matter. Just like you see today. In Rome, for some strange reason, John Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov, all these guys keep meeting down in Rome. What does Rome have to do with anything? In fact, speaking of what Rome has to do with anything, let me ask you the question right here. Bashar al-Assad, the article says, sends a private message to Pope Francis. This is in 2013, okay? The Syrian president told Pontiff countries supporting rebel groups would have to stop before peace can be agreed, the report says. The Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has sent a private message to Pope Francis as a delegation from Damascus visiting the Vatican met on Saturday with the Pontiff's two most senior diplomatic representatives. The contents of the message were not disclosed by the Vatican, which said in the statement simply that Joseph Swede, a Syrian government minister, had met both France's Secretary of State, Archbishop Pietro Paulin, and Foreign Secretary Archbishop Dominique Mambarti. The delegation brought the message from President Assad for the, I don't want to call him the Holy Father, but that's what they call him, and outlined the position of the Syrian government. It added, in fact, when I first looked at this story back in 2013, they were basically saying that President Bashar al-Assad gave his conditions on what he would surrender in this war. What does this man right here, Pope Francis, have to do with the Syrian surrender in a war? By the way, in 2013 is when we find out also that the chemical weapons that were smuggled through Turkey, with Erdogan knowingly that ISIS was smuggling the chemical weapons in there, according to the late MP member Aaron Erdem. Not that he passed away, just he's no longer an MP member in the Turkish government, as far as I'm aware of. But he had actually taken and exposed the connection between the Prime Minister and that of Erdogan, knowingly that the chemical weapons were being smuggled through Turkey in order to blame the Assad government for chemical attack, the sarin gas attack that killed hundreds and hundreds of people there inside of Syria in 2013. But nonetheless, that was all swept under the rug and covered up, other than Aaron Erdem having the courage to stand up and let the world know what was really going on. So again, we see that the Vatican is very much involved in political matters. That's why they have two keys on their flag. And it's called that the keys are to represent both spiritual and temporal powers of the world. And the Vatican believes that they are over both. All temporal governments of the world, as well as all religions of the world, that they are the head of all of these organizations completely. So this is kind of where we're at this point there. We see that there. So what we're doing though is, like I said, I'm wanting to show the influence that Rome has over all the nations around Israel. And of course, as Joe Boehnerman shows, that they are trying to take over Jerusalem. Now, did they actually get Jerusalem? Yes, they did. They did finally get Jerusalem. We find this according to the document here by Guglielmo. Again, it was on January the 2nd of 2013, exclusive, a seat for the Pope at King David's tomb. A historic agreement has been drafted between Israel and the Vatican. The Israeli authorities have granted the Pope an official seat in the room where the Last Supper is believed to have taken place, on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, and where David and Solomon, Jewish kings of Judea, are considered by some researchers also to be also buried. It is a culmination of a long campaign by the Catholic Church to regain religious stewardship over the place where Jesus is supposed to have broken bread and drunk wine with his disciples on the eve of his crucifixion. Now the thing is, Guglio goes on in here and he says, this was done without any referendum by the people. So there was no vote. It was just given to them. And even, as I've pointed out in several of our broadcasts, all the infrastructure around Jerusalem has been changing. They're getting ready to make Jerusalem a city-state. Remember, as I've stated before, Resolution 181, United Nations, 1947, stated clearly and emphatically that there would be an Arab and a Jewish state in the Middle East. You got to remember, this was after World War I, after the British had toppled the Ottoman Empire. They had taken over all this area down here, Israel, modern-day Jordan, Turkey, not Turkey, but Syria. And the land was all carved up and hacked to pieces, and it was spread about with the different people in the regions here. And that's even prophesied in the Bible that they would do it. I shared that with you from the book of Daniel just recently. And I wish I had it up right now. I'd go back over that a little bit again, but I don't recall it by memory right now where that's at. But anyway, so they did that. And they also said in the resolution of 181 that Jerusalem would become a city-state that would be run by an external regime. That would be the Vatican, of course. They don't stipulate that in the UN document, but that's who's to run it. As we can see by the actual actions that are taking place. The Pope is given an official seat there on Mount Zion there at the tomb of David. And not just at the upper room there where he's given the official seat there, but he's been given authority even over the tomb. By the mere fact that what does he do? He goes and he actually has a communion service there inside of King David's tomb. Now, just to share with you, because like I said, we're looking at this from a prophetic standpoint in this message, and like I said, it is lengthy, and I apologize for the lengthiness of it, but it's very important that we go through all this. In Obadiah, which is only one chapter, verse 16, it says here, "For as you have drunk upon my holy mountain, so shall all the nations drink continually. Yea, they shall drink and swallow down, and shall be as though they had not been." Right? Now, don't forget, Pope Francis, he had communion in the upper room. See? In the upper room. And it was actually in 2014. Okay? We go to the images here. You can actually see it. Here it is right here. Here he is again right here on your screen there. This is where they're having the communion service. This is when he's holding the cup up there to drink. Now, ironically, according to the Vatican's own media that was there that filmed it, it was men only during the time that he came there. That might not seem like it matters anything, but until you look at Obadiah's prophecy. It says here, Kikasha shutetem. All right here, Kikasha shutetem al ha-kodeshi. All right, that is, they're going to drink upon my holy mountain. All right. Of course, the holy mountain, by the way, is Mount Zion, Bechad Zion. All right. But what matters here is that it's masculine plural, showing that it would be men only. But then it doesn't stop. Then it says Ishatu, which is gender inclusive plural, Kol Hagoim. And they will, and of course, tamid, which means continually. And they will continually, the nations will continually drink upon my holy mountain. Which nations, in other words, other churches, not just the Vatican, but the Greek, etc., the Methodists, all of those, and it would be both men and women that would participate in communions. And they even did it inside of King David's tomb. Right? So we saw prophecy being fulfilled. And let me just show you that. Okay, communion, let's just pull it up, was held in David's tomb. All right, now some people don't even realize that that actually happened, but it actually did. And there's your photograph that was taken of the and I don't know if that was Catholic or Greek Orthodox that came out of there, but very, very well known photographs of this actually happening. So yes, not only the upper room, but all of Mount Zion has been conquered according to the prophet Obadiah. So we do see these things are so. So let's go back and look at the timeline of things that were happening many, many years ago. And I want to just share with you how these things actually took place. Now, originally, the Zadokite priesthood, Onanias III, was probably the last true Zadokite priest that we actually had, other than his brother Jason. But Jason was the one that sold out to the Greeks. And that's where the downfall began to come. Of course, Menelaus, he ends up getting in there as well. He's the one that has Onanias III murdered. And, of course, it gets worse and worse as time goes on there. Again, like I said, eventually the Maccabees, they do the revolt, they conquer. And then Jonathan Maccabee becomes the high priest. And then several of the Maccabee brothers become high priest of Israel. Totally wrong for them to even do it, but they're doing it anyway, even declaring themselves to be the king of Israel. Completely away from God's word to do so. But let's move right on down. Let's get down here to 63, and in 63 CE, or BC, excuse me, Romans under Pompey conquer the Jewish state. King Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II reinstated as the high priest, and Antipater, an Edomian converted to Judaism, made overseer of Judea. Now notice that. The Romans actually conquer the Jewish state in around 63, but they don't hold on to it. That's what I find interesting as well in repeating history. See, according to, what is it, in the year 40 BC, Antigonus, son of Aristobulus II, made king and high priest, ousting the Romans from control of Jerusalem region with the Parthian support of Hyrcanus II maimed and exiled. What happened in Israel in 1967? All right, but first let's look at this. Rome actually conquers the Jewish state in 63 BC. In modern days, the Romans actually reestablished in 1914 official relationships. They were working on it before, back in the 1800s, the late 1800s, with that of the British Empire. And there is a prophecy about that in Daniel as well. Another one, and I wished I had that one off the top of my head. But they make this relationship. And what did they do? They come in there, they conquer the Ottoman Turks, push them out of the land, and they conquered Israel. The Romans did, way back then. All the way back during in those times there, right? And when they did that, they took over Israel. Now, I'm sorry. My mind got mixed up for just a moment. The Romans, when they made the agreement with the British Empire, they conquered the Ottoman Turks, and in 1914, all that was taken over, and Rome finally gets control through the British Empire, their military force at that time. They get control of the Middle East, including Israel. Now, even though the Arabs are down there, it's still completely ran by Rome through the British military, and the Catholic Church begins to set up their churches down inside of the country of Israel at that time, called Palestine, as they renamed it to be so. So it was not Palestine originally, but that's what they call it, was Palestine. When 1948 comes, even though the UN had made the declaration there would be two states, there was never an intention for Jerusalem to fall into Israeli hands. And in 1948, when Israel gained its own independence, they had to fight for it, but they lost Jerusalem. And of course, this is also about the time when the Qumran scrolls are discovered, and another reason why the Catholic Church had complete control of all the Qumran scrolls for about 50 years before Israelis were ever able to lay eyes on these scrolls. Wonder what happened to most of those scrolls. I can guarantee you one thing, Rome made sure you don't know about it. That is a fact. And there's too many, and people that try to dispute that, there were scholars that have worked on that project that have come out and said the same thing. So I don't just say it by just guesstimating it. It is a fact by scholars that have worked on the Qumran community scrolls that knew about scrolls that went missing completely and has always been kept as a mystery. All right, but Rome lost control, and also they did here back in 40 BC, they lost control as well. What happened in 1967? The Jews have a war and they take Jerusalem. Now that was a shock to the Catholic Church, because you have to remember, back in 48 when Israel first became a nation, there was a very limited number of Jews allowed. Even after the Second World War, were allowed to come into Israel. They were constantly monitoring who could come in. Why? Because they had to have certain families in power that they had molded into being good Catholic boys, but pretending still to be Jews. Now, not to say that they weren't Jewish families, but they had done their forced conversion during the World War II. So see, it was reversed around. What the Maccabees had done, and it was against biblical law, under the law of the Torah, under the writings of the prophets. We were to never force Judaism upon anyone. You had to be a volunteer. But the Maccabees forced conversions when they began to conquer through the land. Well, guess what? It came back upon the Jewish people, because during World War II, the children that were kidnapped or taken away from parents during the Holocaust, they were put in Catholic schools, and they were forced conversions into Catholics. Because why? Rome knew that they would use those converts there. Like we see with Shimon Peres, who went to a Jesuit school. Barry Chalmers pointed that out to me. It was in Yitzhak Rabin's autobiography, I believe is where that's at, that he went to a Jesuit school. What is Shimon Peres going to a Jesuit school for? Well, you know, he might have got rescued during that time. I can't say that for sure, just to point out the issues what they were doing. So they snuck in these Jews, They made them to be what they wanted. And that also brings to the question, what happened to the the Yemenite Jews that went missing, and many of them supposedly went to Europe. I've always wondered if they weren't forced conversions as well, even though they were children, or raised in homes that were Catholic later. I can't prove that. It's only a suggestion or a thought that I've wondered about. So anyway, Rome then, here's what's interesting. In 37 BC, Rome appoints, after the Jews reconquer the region in 40 BC, in 37 BC, Rome appoints Herod the Great, son of Antipater, as king. He reconquers Jerusalem for Rome. Second temple is restored, and Hasmonean dynasty ends. Now that is an interesting note of what we're dealing with today. Because even though the Jews in 1967 conquered Jerusalem and took it away, Rome has now reconquered Jerusalem, and it was done by Herod the Great. And isn't it interesting that the Vatican is always using external powers, whether it be President Obama, whether it be President Clinton, President Bush, all these Herod the Greats, so to speak, the kings that Rome has used, have been in the negotiations to conquer Jerusalem. And now Google Maps has redrawn the maps according to the Oslo Accords. All right, so East Jerusalem now is going back under the control. Well, they officially put it as the Palestinians, but they're going to very soon, in the very near future, make it an official city-state, and then the Jews will be driven out as they were back in 70 AD. All right, now, but let's just stop here for just a moment. I want to show something to you. This is what's important based on the news that we're seeing today. Go back again. The U.S. will possibly, in the very near future, build a base in Jerusalem. This will be the fulfillment of the Roman soldiers that are in Israel. The U.S. Army, NATO forces, whatever you want to call it, they might call it a NATO base there, but they're going to put a NATO force there, and the reason they're going to do it, because it's a Roman military, has to be in Israel to reset the stage. Yeshua, remember, what did he do? He read Isaiah 61:1 when he was here, right? The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me. He's anointed me to bring good tidings. You know, remember this here? I'm just paraphrasing it. But he cut off in verse 2, half of the verse. He stopped, he closed the book, said, "This day the scripture has been fulfilled in your ears." Right? The other half, it was where the judgment comes, he didn't read. So he's returning. The Messiah is returning. So in order for him to return, the stage has to be set the way it was when he left. The Romans have to be in control. But what I find interesting is that it's repeating the same way it did all those years ago. All right, here's another interesting thing. Let's look at this right here. Syria was an early Roman province annexed to the Roman Republic in 64 BC by Pompey in the Third Mithridatic War, following the defeat of the Armenian king Tigranes the Great, following the partition of the Heronian kingdom into the Tetrarchies in 6 AD. It was gradually absorbed into Rome provinces, with Roman Syria annexing, this whole region, all the way up to 135 AD. Now, look at what's happening today. Russia caused something to happen that was unexpected. And you can find that in the book of Daniel as well, chapter 11, when it speaks about that tidings out of the east and out of the north will trouble the king of the north. Right? They weren't expecting Russia to come into Syria. It was something that threw them off. John Kerry even said that. We did not expect Russia to step in. They were toppling Bashar al-Assad. They've been toppling all these regions. There's more than one reason for this, friends. It's not just the fact that the Romans want to control all this area. But you have to understand why they want to control this area. And a lot of it has to do with the ancient artifacts that are there. Iraq, when the U.S. military conquered Iraq, the first thing they did, not secure the gold in the banks, not to secure the military, they went to the museums. They secured all the ancient writings that are there that are 4,000 years old, written on stones. Same thing about Syria, especially on the border of Syria and Turkey. All that area, you see where the Turkish government came in and took over northern Syria? President Putin, do you not even realize why they're doing this? The Turkish government is fighting to take over this area because hidden in different places in Syria there is some very important artifacts they want control of. All right? And that's a different issue altogether. But notice that the Romans had actually conquered the Syrian province in 64 BC. And slowly but surely they absorbed into the Roman Empire. Okay? Now, what is the United States doing right now? The United States, let's see if I don't think I have this in the right order here. They're wanting to divide Syria. According to the Arab News here, it's not easy to divide Syria. Since the start of the Syrian uprising in 2011 against the regime of President Bashar al-Assad, analysts have been predicting the country's division along ethnic and sectarian lines due to fears of the well-being of minorities. The uprising turned into a civil war, then into a military interference by the foreign powers such as Iran and Russia and Hezbollah. But the United States right now, since Russia began to, with the Syrian government, took over East Aleppo, and they didn't expect to lose this war, now the U.S. as the war seems to be coming to an end, and Bashar al-Assad is now regaining control of a lot of his country there, other than Turkey being in the northern province there. Now the United States begins to start pumping weapons again into the rebels there. They're wanting to change everything. Now they're calling Belgium. The other day we reported how Belgium said that they would get Assad a bunch of money to give an autonomous region area for the rebels. And every time there is a surrender, it's not a surrender to take them prisoner. They just send them to another part of Syria. Rome is not going to lose this war. Why? Because in the future, part of this Syria, if not all of Syria, part of this Syria has got to be under Roman control. Why? Because they're going to use the Syrians to attack Israel. Remember, Rome took control of Jerusalem, but originally when the Maccabees were still there, they had made a covenant with Rome, hoping to bring about peace and stability. That's what Israel did today. Prime Minister Netanyahu, do you not realize your covenant with the United States and with Rome that you've made is the worst thing in the world you could have ever done? And I would say many Christians probably think, well, the U.S. would build a military base, that would be great there. The U.S. is going to protect them, and God will bless America. But that would be great if it was for a good reason. But you don't understand. It's not for a good reason. The U.S. military, like the British military, like NATO's military, like the United Nations, is all controlled by the Vatican. That's Roman military. The Apocalypse of Thomas clearly said that in the latter days, the world's economy will be bankrupt because of the Roman soldiers. You don't think it's not a Roman military? Let me share some stuff here with you. CIA and the Vatican's intelligence apparatus. Look at this article right here. This is on Church and State on their website, .org.uk. All right. One day in July 1944, as the Second World War raged throughout Europe, General William Wild Bill Donovan, as they called him, was ushered into an ornate chamber in the Vatican City for an audience with Pope Pius the 12th. Donovan bowed his head reverently as the pontiff intoned a ceremonial prayer in Latin and decorated him with the Grand Cross of the Order of St. Sylvester, the oldest and most prestigious papal knighthoods. This award was been given to only 100 other men in history. All right? It goes into a lot of issues here in this article here. It'll be in the description below. The Vatican, the Mossad, the CIA, they all have their secret intelligence agencies working together. And Rome controls it. When I did an official tour in Rome by an official Catholic guide there, he said that. The two keys on the flag, temporal and spiritual powers. And he said Rome controls all the governments of the world. That's what he said. You tell them then, right? You tell them, right? It's crazy. And to mention, I mentioned, like it was, now when I bring up Syria, and I said that they're going to use the people in Syria eventually to launch an attack on Israel, that's what they did back under Titus, the Roman general. All right, let's go over here, Daniel 9:24. Or let's see, this is where we get the 70 weeks of Daniel, right? Daniel 9:26. And after 62 weeks shall an anointed one be cut off. After the 62 weeks. That's after the 69th week. So somewhere in the 70th week is that anointed one cut off. A lot of people looking for a 7-year tribulation. But according to this right here, the anointed one, which is the Messiah, that's what it says in Hebrew right here, Mashiach. Okay? Just in case you can't see it there, Mashiach. Alright? Ikarat Mashiach. The Messiah is cut off. Alright? After. He's cut off after. The acharei, after after the 69 and 2 weeks there that you're seeing there, or the 69 weeks, the Messiah is cut off. Now, we could argue and say, okay, he died one day after the 69th week. All right. So I don't want to split hairs here and say there's still not 7 years, because a lot of people are looking for 7 years. So you could say it technically that way. But I kind of wonder, when he has a 3.5-year ministry to the Jews themselves, was it halfway through the week? That's just a consideration that we should look at. All right? But anyway, he's cut off. But watch what happens next. And the people of a prince, not the Mashiach, not the anointed one, that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. So there is a coming prince that's going to be of the people that destroyed the city and the sanctuary. We know that Titus, the Roman general, in 70 AD destroyed the temple and the sanctuary. But as many well-known biblical scholars have pointed out, including Chuck Missler, I know Chuck, been filmed with Chuck before, but even as Chuck said, the Syrian military worked with the Romans and they did most of the dirty work. Well, sure they did. Because look right here. What did Rome do? Rome in 64 BC conquered Syria. What did they do with the Syrians there? They brought them in to help destroy the second temple. Is that right? Sure they did. 70 AD. So the Romans, even though they made a covenant with Israel, they turned against the Jews after all and destroyed the temple. And not only destroyed the temple, but they even were trying to kill Yeshua, trying to find him and kill him too. That's what they're doing today. They might be making a covenant with Israel, but believe me, and let me tell you something, you don't think they've been killing all the babies ever since then? Sure they have. What do you think abortion was set into motion for? Now I'm not saying the Catholic Church doesn't condone abortion. I agree with that. They don't. But I guarantee you one thing, Catholic Church also doesn't condone necessarily war. But their Roman soldiers will do the war for them. Okay? So just keep that in mind. So as we see these things, let's go back to this little list over here. All right, so the Romans, they got back control, and now the Romans are back in control of Jerusalem again. We are headed to the destruction. But before the destruction of the temple, you got to remember though, the Romans got back in control here in 37 BC. And the second temple was restored under the Hasmonean dynasty. So that also tells me that Rome will have a heavy hand in building the third temple. Even though they're going to be part of the ones that destroy it, they're going to build the third temple. Because that's the way it was 2,000 years ago, at the coming of the Messiah. So the Romans have to also be the ones that have the hand in building the third temple today at the coming of the Messiah. But remember, see, that's in 37. Now, it's going to be nearly 100 years by the time well, actually it's 40 years in building, so by the time that they get there, 70 years later, the temple is actually destroyed. Right? Now, I don't think it's going to take that long this time around here. But they're going to build the third temple. And the Romans are going to be the ones that have every bit to do with it. And they're going to also take over everything. Now, there's some things here that you should notice too. Watch this here. Let me see. I've got some notes about this. Let's go down to BC 4. Almost the time of the birth of Yeshua, right? King Herod the Great dies. Jesus is born. And King Herod's 3 sons share power. Herod Archelaus, appointed ruler of Judea and Samaria. Galilee and Perea, ruled by his brother Herod Antipas. And northeast of Galilee, ruled by Herod and Philip. And they're talking about carving up Israel all over again. You ever think about that? Here we are at the advent of the second coming of the Messiah, and they're wanting to carve up Israel again. And not only that, notice that Herod had 3 sons. And what are they trying to do with this Mekodeshet in Israel? They're trying to take their 3 sons, Christianity, the Islamic religion, the Muslims that is, and the Catholic religion and Judaism. All 3 faiths they're trying to bring together as one family, a faceless God, and they're trying to do it right inside of Israel. All right? Now remember, what was this? What do we have here? Daniel 11:16. What does it say here? All right? But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the beauty of this. Wait a minute, that's not the one. Am I in the right place? Yeah, let me see where. Oh, I think it's 14. Oh, okay, it's 14. I'm sorry. Verse 14, Daniel 11, okay? And the king of the north shall come and cast up a mound and take a well-fortified city, and the arms of the south shall not withstand. And as for his chosen people, there shall be no strength in them. Oh, I'm still in the wrong verse. I apologize, guys. Verse 14, that's where I keep my again. And in those times there shall be many stand up against the king of the south. Also the children of the violent among thy people shall lift themselves up to establish the vision, but they shall stumble. All right? Now, but it doesn't actually say, it's close, all right? The children of the violent among thy people. This right here. It's actually the sons, plural, and the sons of the lawless, paratzi, lawless, of your people. Inasu lahamid. They're going to what? They don't lift themselves up to establish the vision, hazon, but they try to marry the vision. The word Mekodeshet, which is what the Vatican is using in the ecumenical movement in Israel to bring together the 3 faiths, means to espouse or engage. It is used as an adjective, Mekodeshet. We say that in Hebrew as an engagement. All right? And what is it? It's Herod's 3 sons. It is Christian, Jews, and Muslims. And that's what Rome is doing. Not to say there's not genuine Christians, not to say there's not genuine Jews, not to say that there's not Arabic people that are good people. I'm not against the Arabic people. You have to understand that. I'm not against the Christians. I'm not against the Jews. I'm not against anybody. But I'm against the system that they're using to do what? To try to destroy the Messiah. Because Herod was all about trying to kill Yeshua. All right? Now, so we see that prophecy right there. That's what we're seeing today. But what's going to happen? Now, I mentioned to you that Rome is working on, through the United States, through the negotiations that are actually happening in Rome, okay? So remember that, the negotiations that John Kerry are doing with Lavrov, trying to get the Russians to give up some land there so that their thugs, you know, the moderate Syrian opposition who beheads children, the Free Syrian Army, the Al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, all these thugs can live somewhere there inside of Syria. Why? Why do they want them there? Because as they conquered them back 2,000 years ago at 64 BC, Rome again is conquering the Syrian people, and they're wanting to use them as a future date to come against Israel. As we see ISIS here in this article here on the Jerusalem Post, when it says ISIS is kilometers away from Israel's northern border. A new video shows ISIS-linked coalition advancing on the Yarmouk Valley region located in the triple border junction between Israel's sites in Jordan and Syria, Channel 2 reports. It's not Bashar al-Assad that you have to be afraid of, my Jewish brothers and sisters. It's the one that you made your covenant with. That's the danger. And of course his thugs and his cronies, this evil bunch of illegitimate bastard children in Syria, not President Bashar al-Assad, not the Syrian people, not the Kurdish people, not the Christians of Syria. They're not your enemy. It's that group that NATO backs. That's the ones. Because NATO is Rome. Rome has made the covenant with you. And Rome will turn against you, Prime Minister Netanyahu. He will turn against you. The only thing that's going to change any of this is the coming of the two witnesses. That's the only thing. All right? And speaking of the coming of the two witnesses for my Jewish brethren, and saviors shall come up on Mount Zion to judge the mount of Esau, Edomites, Romans, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's. God's got to do something to change this before it's too late. But they're going to set up the entire thing. And the covenant that Israel has made with Rome is nothing but a repeat of 2,000 years ago when the Maccabees, after this, some of Jonathan and them, and some of them had died off, when they got scared and made a covenant with Rome. The Romans came in. The Romans finally put their military in Israel as well. And then finally they put Edomite kings inside of Rome. You crowned an Edomite king called Pope Francis when he wore a triple crown, and you put him inside. Let me see if I still have that picture up. When you allowed that Edomite king, all right, you allowed him to wear a triple crown. And I've got it in here too. He's wearing his triple crown. I know in several pictures he's not wearing it, but in this one right here, he is wearing it. And I don't think it allows you to see it close up enough to be able to see it well enough, but he's wearing his crown. You allowed an Edomite king to be granted a seat at King David's tomb. Israel has repeated history the way it was 2,000 years ago. And the only reason I think it's even repeating, friends, is because the Messiah himself wants you to see where you made your mistake. Then we will see in Zechariah, as even Zechariah's prophecy, all right? Let me just remind you of that. That's something maybe we should take a look at once again. If you look at the book of Zechariah in closing, because I know I've been very lengthy with this and I apologize for being so lengthy. Zechariah chapter 12. What do we have? Israel does return to their homeland in verse 6. In that day will I make the chiefs of Judah like a pan of fire among the wood, and like a torch of fire among the sheaves. And they shall devour all the peoples round about them, the right hand and on the left, and Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place, even in Jerusalem. Sure you will. The Lord also shall save the tents of Judah first, that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem be not magnified above Judah. So yes, the house of Judah comes home first before the house of Israel can come back home. Right? But when you get on down, verse 10, and I will pour upon the house of David, inhabitants of Jerusalem, the spirit of grace and supplication, and they shall look upon me because they have thrust him through. Actually, before that, verse 8, in that day shall the Lord defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and him that stumbleth among them, that day shall be as David. I think I still missed something here. No, that's right. Okay, and the David of the house shall be as godlike, being as the angel of the Lord before them. And it shall come to pass in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. And I will pour out upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. And they shall look upon me because they have thrust him through, and they shall mourn for him as one that mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. And that day there shall be in great mourning as Jerusalem as in mourning of Hadramon in the valley of Megiddo. So see, it's also a recognition of the coming of the Messiah. Now, this not only does this show that we're coming back to the promised land, but let me show you one prophecy that most of our brothers overlook. Even though Prime Minister Netanyahu is actually quoted from the prophet Micah himself, and yet at the same token, he's quoted from the prophet Micah, but he often tends to ignore, even though we did return forevermore, as Micah states. And I think that's in verse 6 as well. And in that day, saith the Lord, I will gather and assemble her that is halted, and I will gather her that is driven away, and her that I have afflicted. And I will make her that is halted a remnant, and her that was cast afar off a mighty nation. The Lord shall reign over them in Mount Zion from henceforth forevermore. All right? But when you get down here to verse 9, he says, why do you cry out aloud? Is there no king in thee? Is thy counselor perished? The pains have taken hold of thee as a woman in travail. Be in pain and labor to bring forth, O daughter of Zion. Like a woman in travail, for now thou shalt go forth out of the city, and thou shalt dwell in the field. So yes, we did come home to Zion forevermore. But like it was 2,000 years ago, we conquered Jerusalem, but sure enough, the Romans took it back from you again. And you're going to go out from the city of Israel, from Jerusalem. Part of this United Nations push to force you out. Because why? You made a covenant with the Romans. God even told Moses, when he promised that he would return to you in this day that you're living in, make no covenants with the inhabitants of the land when you come. Don't make any covenants. You shouldn't have. It's your own demise. But maybe that's what it takes to bring the Messiah. I'm Stephen Ben-denoon. You're watching Israeli News Live, Ben-denoon Institute as well. God bless you. Thank you. And thank you for supporting this work that we're doing here. Again, if you would like to be a part of that, IsraeliNewsLive.org or IsReturns.com. Shalom. Or the King James Version Bible there. I believe the Sefer also is another Bible that carries the book of Maccabees as well, both the first and second. I can't say for sure, but I think they do as well. But anyway, the book of Maccabees is more of a chronological order of the wars that happened there, where the Maccabee brothers were trying to overthrow the Greeks who had taken and suppressed the Israeli people. But it's also under the time frame of the Greek Hellenization of the Jewish people, when the Greeks had conquered Israel, that we also find that the priesthood had begun to change from the true Zadokite priesthood, the true Levitical priesthood, and eventually through different political means and things that had happened there, through even murders and conspiracies, that the priesthood is actually changed over from being the true Zadokites, the true Levites, to a non-Levitical priesthood. Even including one of the Maccabee brothers, Jonathan Maccabee, who was appointed as a high priest in 152 BC. He becomes a high priest of Israel, totally with, from what I can understand, has no right to that bloodline. I believe he is actually a Benjamite and not a Levite. So the whole priesthood really got all mixed up. It becomes a Hasmonean dynasty at that time there under the Maccabees and forward all the way down to the time of the coming of Jesus of Nazareth, or Yeshua. And so the whole priesthood really gets all mixed up pretty much. I'm very deep into the things that are happening in the Middle East and how they actually are very much mirrored by the events that happened 2,000 years ago, leading up to, the coming of Christ, in fact. And I think that's very significant when we begin to look at this. And of course, what got me started on this was the suggestion by Anwar News there that the United States is actually going to build a base. Aman News, that suggested that the U.S. will actually build a base in the very near future inside of Israel. Before we get started in this, no doubt going to be a lengthy broadcast here, let me just remind you guys as well, we are trying to work out all the bugs with our website, IsraeliNewsLive.org and .co.il, as well as Israel Returns, because there were those that were having trouble to help support this work that we're doing. And of course, we do need your help in making this possible, the work that we do here at Israeli News Live, as well as Ben-denoon Institute. So if God lays it on your heart and you'd like to contribute, please visit our website at IsraeliNewsLive.org or IsraelReturns.com. And there's a place to donate there, or our address at the end of the broadcast here. If you are having any difficulties, please email me at stephenbenoon@aol.com. I am way behind on emails, but I try to answer them as quickly as I possibly can. Let's get right into this, so it's very serious here. According to this report here, and I shared this on Israeli News Live just recently, that the U.S. intends to use the Israeli coast Erev Tov Chavrim, I'm ben-denoon. You're watching Israeli News Live, a very important broadcast this evening. Friends, this is a prophetic segment of our news. We actually were going to run this particular presentation on Ben-denoon Institute alone, with just a portion here on Israeli News Live. But as I begin to really think about the significance of a prophetic message here in light of news that we're seeing happening there in the Middle East, I really felt like that it was important that we air this broadcast in its entirety here on Israeli News Live as well. So those of you that do appreciate and enjoy these types of messages, please stay tuned with us. Those of you that just prefer the news only, I understand if you prefer not to tune in. I think, though, that it would be a blessing to you nonetheless because we're going to go to a military base against troops in nearby areas, including Russian forces in Syria, according to the Al-Masada News Amman report. The U.S. National Defense Authorization Act of the NDAA stipulating the Israel-based news website said that according to the NDAA subsection, the U.S. military is to establish a maritime base in the Israeli coastal city of Haifa in the coming years. Now, this is based on the National Defense Authorization Act of 2017 under Section 1259 that entitles the United States to be able to do exactly that. And that's what the report actually comes from. So I think it's a very legitimate report. And in light of this, it only shows me that what Rome did 2,000 years ago, when they had actually conquered Israel and had taken over the country there, and had put their own king in place there, then of course the Roman military was not far behind. And we're going to look at some of that tonight, looking at how this happened all those years ago. As we can see here, actually that's not that one there. Let me go right here. Sorry about that. It is actually and this is what's interesting. In 63 BC, we see that the Romans under the Pompey conquer the Jewish state. King Aristobulus II is deposed. Hyrcanus II reinstated as the high priest, and Antipater, and an Edomian convert to Judaism, is made overseer of Judea. Now, it's kind of interesting. We're going to have to kind of double back real quick a little bit on the historical side of Israel up into this time here, because if you'll notice, Antipater, an Edomian, was a convert to Judaism, and that is what a Jesuit is, but in a reverse order. The Jesuits of Rome, for example, are Catholics, but they are Catholics that were Jews, but they became converts. But it's interesting about the part about the conversion, because what a lot of people don't realize is under the Maccabees, when the Maccabees revolted, and that was around, 167, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere right in that era, 168, the Maccabee brothers actually began their revolt. 166 is when the uprising began under Judas Maccabee, which Maccabee was not actually his real last name, but that's just the name that they're given because of their revolting there. But when Judas Maccabee began to revolt, and it wasn't just a revolt that lasted a few months. This is a revolt that lasted about 25 years. And of course, this is where we get the wonderful holiday in Israel we call Hanukkah, the incredible miracle of lights, as is considered to be under the Jewish beliefs there, where the menorah, when the temple is being restored back, taken away from the Hellenization through the Greeks there, where they had perverted the temple. They found one of the priestly oils there, but it's only supposed to last 1 day, but miraculously seems to last for 8 days. And this is where we get the story of Hanukkah from, all during the time of the Maccabee brothers. Now, the book of Maccabees, there's two books, first and second book of Maccabees. It is in the Catholic Bible, but it's not in our